Household electricity is often treated as one of the few systems in modern life that feels fixed. It is expected to work in the background, with little thought, little attention, and almost no active involvement from the people who rely on it every day. Lights turn on, refrigerators stay cold, devices charge, heating and cooling systems respond, and routine continues without interruption. Because this process is so consistent under normal conditions, most households relate to electricity as a permanent utility rather than as a dependency with conditions, limits, and vulnerabilities. That perception tends to hold until the moment continuity breaks. In many cases, the first meaningful awareness comes during a visible disruption, an outage, a sharp increase in cost, a weather-related service interruption, a regional grid event, or a technical fault that affects access for hours or days. What changes in that moment is not only convenience, it is the realization that many parts of daily life are tied to a system that most people do not control, do not inspect, and do not fully understand in practical terms. The apparent stability of household electricity is real only within a framework of infrastructure, pricing, maintenance, regulation, fuel sourcing, weather exposure, and grid balance that remains mostly invisible during normal operation. Most people respond to this realization in limited and familiar ways. They may try to reduce usage manually, become more cautious with heating or cooling, unplug devices, switch light bulbs, or pay closer attention to peak consumption periods. Others begin looking into backup options, such as fuel-powered generators, battery systems, or solar installations. These responses are understandable because they align with what is already visible in the public conversation around energy. Use less, spend less, prepare for outages, diversify if possible. But these common attempts often reveal another layer of the problem. Reducing usage may lower some costs, but it does not change dependence on the wider system. Backup devices may offer temporary support, but many introduce their own constraints. Fuel storage, noise, weather limitations, maintenance schedules, installation complexity, high upfront expense, or limited runtime. Even more structured alternatives, such as solar systems, remain tied to local conditions, orientation, storage capacity, and cost recovery timelines that may or may not fit a household's actual context. In other words, many of the commonly recognized responses do not remove the structural fragility. They shift, reduce, or redistribute it. This is where the issue becomes less about a single utility bill or a single outage, and more about system design. Household electricity feels stable because the consumer experience is designed to feel simple. The infrastructure behind it is not simple. It depends on generation capacity, transmission reliability, local distribution networks, regulatory decisions, pricing models, physical maintenance, environmental conditions, and demand fluctuations. The household sees only the final layer, power available at the outlet. That narrow interface creates the impression of certainty, even though the chain behind it is conditional at every stage. A useful distinction here is between accessibility and control. Electricity may be accessible most of the time, but that does not mean the household has meaningful control over its continuity, cost trajectory, or resilience under changing conditions. This difference is often overlooked because modern utility systems are engineered to reduce visible friction. The less people need to think about a system, the more stable it appears. Yet this same convenience can delay awareness of deeper constraints until those constraints become expensive, disruptive, or difficult to ignore. Over time, this has led some households to explore energy formats that exist outside conventional utility dependence, not necessarily as full replacements, but as parallel structures. These formats vary widely. Some are practical only in specific environments. Some require technical knowledge or installation support. Some are expensive enough to remain out of reach for the average household. Others exist mainly in niche communities focused on preparedness, self-reliance, or off-grid experimentation. The relevance of these alternatives is not that they solve the issue universally. It is that their existence reflects a broader recognition that standard household electricity, while highly functional, is not synonymous with autonomy. Within that wider context, some products are positioned not as upgrades to the grid, but as responses to the underlying dependency problem itself. These products are usually framed around continuity, reduced reliance, and the possibility of maintaining certain forms of household function outside conventional channels. Whether they are practical, scalable, or appropriate depends entirely on the specific format, the claims being made, and the household context in which they are considered. Their significance, in analytical terms, is that they emerge from the same structural observation. Electricity appears stable, largely because its instability is absorbed elsewhere until it can no longer be. Seen this way, household electricity is not unstable in the dramatic sense. It is stable within a managed system that most consumers experience only at the endpoint. The issue is not that the system fails constantly. The issue is that its reliability is often mistaken for permanence, and its convenience is mistaken for control. Once that distinction becomes visible, the subject changes. It is no longer only about paying for power or reacting to outages. It becomes a question of how much continuity in daily life depends on infrastructure that remains, for most people, external, conditional, and difficult to influence. That is why electricity often feels stable until it doesn't. Not because the system is illusory, but because the consumer experience is narrow. What appears fixed at the surface is sustained by a much larger structure beneath it, and most of that structure becomes visible only when something interrupts the routine it was built to protect.